Drawing my characters in a card illustration similarly to Genshin Impact, this was a goal I set for myself and something I wanted to learn to do, and over the past 3 videos I've talked about the preparations I took for this by analyzing Genshin's character designs to first design my own characters and then analyzing the Genshin art style to be able to finally draw the illustrations, what I'll be doing today. As I talk about my process for this, I will also mention what I learned from this whole project. I hope it will be helpful to you as well. Let's get started with the process. Overall, I'll draw 3 illustrations for 3 characters today, since I designed 3 characters and I find doing multiple illustrations helpful to be able to apply things you learn in one in the next one. I started out with doing thumbnails, and because I knew I wanted to draw 3 characters overall, I could already plan this out so the characters would line up nicely. I first made silhouette thumbnails using some Pinterest references. I picked out 3 I liked and made one face to the right, one to the middle and one to the left so the characters would line up. My character designs are for characters that are the Sun, Moon and Star guardians for their world, and for the Genshin character designs I was also inspired by this. So here for the card illustrations I also added the Sun, Moon and a Star as symbols to help with refining the poses and get some clarity for how I would want the flow to work in each illustration. After this I moved on to the individual illustrations, starting with the Moon Guardian Yumari. If you would like to know more about who he is and his character design, I would recommend watching the video where I designed him and the other characters first. For now, a basic description would be a mysterious mirror manufacturer from Inazuma with a hydro vision. He has the tall male body type and is a rather gentle, calm person. I started with sketching his body. Overall, I first like to draw the head before adding hair or the body before adding clothes. I marked the anatomy to make sure it makes sense for the pose and that proportions don't look off. I also compared my body drawing to Genshin's bodies from my analysis of the poses. Here I noticed that for my character the shoulders and hips were pretty wide at first and I adjusted this. For the body I was unsure how arched forward the torso should be and whether the legs should be angled more forward or to the back. I wanted the body's pose to fit to the moon crescent shape, but also knew I could add in flowy outfit parts to make this work later on. After the face, something that I find can add a lot to each Genshin illustration would be the hands. They can be pretty expressive, and for the hand poses for Yumari I wanted to go with elegant ones. I then sketched in the outfit, referencing my character sheet. Applying what I see to different perspectives is something I do almost daily when drawing fan art for any character, so this wasn't too difficult to me as long as I was paying attention to the body's perspective. What I had some freedom to experiment here would be the capes and in general parts that could be affected by motion and wind, like the tassels in Yumari's design. Figuring out a nice flow for them was interesting, and this is something that plays a role and is important in many Genshin card illustrations as well. I also wanted to add depth here by having the cape in the back change direction so you can see it from the front and back at parts. I wanted Yumari to hold the mirror from his design in his hand, and for the hand in the back I thought of adding some magic effects here since Yumari is a catalyst fighter, and this would also add some flowiness. Usually I use more different colors to sketch to help me separate parts, but here I basically only use 2. I hid some layers when doing the line art to be able to focus on just one part at a time here. And the line art is what I'll move on to next. This is pretty straightforward. I'm drawing over my sketch layer from which I lowered the opacity. The only thing I experimented on changing here would be that I adjusted the arms sizes along the way. When filling in flat colors I referenced my character sheet. Then I started with shading, while I talked about separating the shading into 1 ambient occlusion shadows, 2 contact shadows, 3 fold shadows, and for hue variation or saturated borders I did not use this to separate my shadow layers. I rather went with a more intuitive approach, focusing on adding all shadows rather than each one separately. This can be faster since you don't have to go through each one, and it can help to make the shading process feel more straightforward since you can just add all the shadows you would be able to see at a time. But this process can also be slower and not as structured if you're unsure with where the shadows should be. Things that stood out here was to make the legs separated through the shading. The leg further in the back is darker. The shading of the silver string around the upper body would be something I redid since when first painting it I wasn't sure how the shadows would work. I referenced Ayato's design but didn't fully understand it, so I studied it again and defined the shadows more later on. And yeah, here I would just recommend when you use a reference, whether that's from a Genshin card or just a real life reference, to not just look at it and replicate what you see, but also understand it and observe more carefully. For the gold and crystals as well as the sea Ganoderma, I also made sure to shade them accordingly to their material by referencing Genshin illustrations, and that's how it went for shading. I adjusted the values afterwards by referencing Genshin's illustrations and duplicating some of the shadow layers. After this, I was almost done. After about 2 days, I looked back at the illustration to get a new view on it and to critique it. Here are some things I wrote down and adjusted afterwards. I found the outline shadow on the lower leg in the front too dark and made it brighter. I didn't like the chest shading, it was too dark and the contrast was too heavy to me. I adjusted this by mainly using Baiju's cut as a reference. Other than this, I changed up the shading on the silver accessoire wrapping around Yumari's upper body, the moon's cutter for the chest, and the accessoires hanging in the back. Overall, I painted over a lot of areas to refine the elements more. For example, the dreamcatcher at Yumari's left hip was not standing out from the body too much at first, so I wanted there to be more of a clear separation as I painted over and adjusted this. The shading of the hair also had too much contrast, so I made this softer. Next, I changed up the look of some of his purple outfit parts by removing the small highlight lines on them. I wanted the material there to not be shiny in the end. After this, I then added a Hydro character background placeholder. I'm saying placeholder here because I initially only added monster templates I found from Winnie Hill on DeviantArt. Later on, I then also downloaded Inazuma ones by Fairy Till Light on Twitter. I'm really grateful for the Genshin community providing these materials. I added in some water effects here. In most card illustrations, you won't have as many magic effects as I added, but for the illustrations I kind of wanted them to also act a bit like the Wish illustrations, where the character is drawn with their magic and weapons. For the water here, I mainly referenced Ayato's card, and I went back to the moon silhouette shape I wanted to use for this illustration to come up with the flow of the water. I used layer effects to automatically add a outline to the layer I painted the water on for this here. Then I also painted over the pattern on the cape in front, and like this, the first illustration for this video is done. Let's move on to the second one. This would be Koru. You see that the process I used would be around the same as for Yumari. I experimented with his pose. I thought about him putting one of his legs up like he'd be walking, but I went with him just standing since his arms already are very expressive. I wanted Koru's legs to still be much further apart than for Yumari since he's very confident, while for Yumari the pose should convey his gentleness, elegance and calmness. For Koru the pose should represent his activeness, confidence and extrovertedness. For a basic description for Koru, you could describe him as an outgoing, fun explorer. He is also from Inazuma like Yumari and has a pyro vision. For the hand poses, I have a file where I keep some of my hand drawings and I added in some poses from there. Here I struggled with applying the outfit parts in perspective for the belt especially. At first it looked pretty straight, then more rounded. I discovered how important it is to keep the perspective and volume of the whole body in mind to draw the outfit parts. Imagining how the parts wrap around the body really helps for this. Then I also experimented with the arm on the left. This led to the hand being more lifted up, foreshortened than in the initial pose in the end. I also thought about putting this arm up or down but disregarded the ideas. Additionally, I thought about adding some powers to make the overall pose and silhouette fit more to a sun shape, and you'll see if I included this by the end of the process. Then we move on to line art. I went over my sketch, which was pretty rough, and this would be another thing that I struggled with here. Having a too rough sketch led to me spending more time on the line art since I had to define and make the lines clear here. Especially for the gold metal parts, more straight, symmetrical and mechanical shapes should be used, and this was especially hard to draw without a clear sketch underneath. Other than this, I paid attention to making the silhouette lines thicker than the inner lines. I find first drawing the silhouettes and bigger shapes with my line art brush set to a wider thickness helpful, and afterwards moving on to the inner parts and details with a slightly thinner brush. I first drew the back at the left side more turned away from the viewer, but later changed it up to be more to the front. This helped to fill up the space at the left hip, which otherwise would be pretty empty. But it's good to have some contrast with detail to not make the image overwhelming. I found this added nicely to the illustration. Then I filled in the colors using a character design sheet. Next it was time for shading. I made the sketch layer of the body visible to shade the anatomy. As mentioned in my Genshin art style analysis, to portray anatomy in Genshin, shading is used and not lines, and I discovered I like this look to portray the anatomy myself as well, so I would plan to also do this in my own art in the future. The shading process here went pretty smoothly. I went through each color and added the ambient occlusion as well as the cast shadows, and other than this I then also added the fold shadows and some hue variation and highlights. The gold shading would be one thing that was more difficult here, especially when now looking at the boots on the left. The upper left part of the diamond shaped accessoire would be too bright. This is something I wrote down during my critique after finishing the shading, and that's what I talk about next, the things I adjusted. First we'd have the eyes. Initially the upper lash appeared too thin to me. Koru also didn't seem to look in the same direction with both eyes. Other than this, for the face I made his nose appear softer by painting over the line, making it lighter. I also adjusted his mouth a bit, and like this his expression changed. Next, the hand on the right. Koru's left hand was too big compared to the face to me, so I made it smaller. The other hand is bigger since it is more foreshortened, so the proportions there worked for me. The pattern on the gold part of Koru's belt also seemed too busy to me, me, so I removed this and added it in on the brown part underneath. Here I kinda changed up the character design this way, but I felt like it helped to make the card more readable. On the belt, the shading of the purple part also looked off to me, so I painted over this. Finally, the gold parts and Koro's outfit, especially for the lower leg, looked weird to me. The shape for them was not as symmetrical and kind of organic, but when you have armor, it usually looks more symmetrical and mechanical. So here I painted over parts to make the shapes look more defined. I put the pyro placeholder background behind Koro and adjusted the values in the illustration of him a bunch of times to make sure he would stand out from the background. After these adjustments, I added in some fire in a circular way around Koro as well. I used this circular shape since it would fit to the sun to me. For this I referenced mostly Diluc's wish. I find it interesting how the fire is portrayed differently for many Pyro Genshin characters' wish illustrations. And finally it's time to talk about Kira. And just as a side note, this process went much more smoothly as for the previous illustrations, probably because I was getting more used to drawing illustrations the way I drew them here. A basic description for Kira would be kind-hearted curious guide. He's a map maker from Sumeru with a animal vision. Kira has the medium male body type, not the tall male one like the previous two characters, and drawing his pose and body went pretty smoothly. I was happy with it right away, but you'll see I adjusted a few things here later on as well. However, while sketching it all looked fine to me. To me, Kira's pose looks the most dynamic. Let me know which pose from the illustrations you like most. Here I also was including a lot of flowy parts and experimented with their flow along the way. Flowy parts in Kira's outfit would include his jewelry and the necklace, the cape, the four longer parts hanging from the pants, and his skirt over his pants. For the flow of the four parts, they're kinda diagonal, opposing to the flow of the body. This is similar to one of his necklaces. I find that this makes the illustration more dynamic. For the hands, I again added some from my hand study files. Kira's pose was supposed to show elegance, dynamicness, and his curiosity, and with that, the sketch would be done. Next we move on to line art. I started off with the face and hair. I do this for sketching, line art and shading since I find getting this to work most important, because for characters this tends to be the focal point, and when I start with each stage I tend to have more focus than at the end, so it makes sense to focus on this at first. When something in the face looks off, it tends to be more easily noticeable than for the body or the clothes. After the head I then usually move on to the hands, something that also is pretty expressive and important in most character illustrations. Since Kira's clothes are pretty skin tight, I just drew the body line art for most of his outfit. Then I went on to add in the bigger shapes and next the smaller shapes and accessoires, once again going from thicker to thinner lines. I ended off with adding the patterns. For this I used a layer with a layer effect that added a outline to the strokes I made, similarly to the water or fire for Yumari's and Koro's illustrations before. Before filling in all flat colors, I just filled in the silhouettes for the face, hair, eyes, shoulders, arms and the leg in front. I did this to be able to make adjustments to these parts of the character specifically. If I found anything there looked off, I'm usually able to easier tell if something does look off when I also see the volume. That's also why I, for example, mark the body's anatomy when sketching or fill in silhouettes, mostly for the face and hair. Now let's finally talk about the shading for this illustration, what I moved on to after I had filled in the flat colors once again. While for Yumari's legs I made the one in the back darker, here for Kira I made the one in the back lighter, adding in depth by making body parts that are further to the back or front have more or less contrast or a different hue, and brightness is something I also mentioned in my art style analysis video. Here I wanted to apply this to separate the cape in the back from the body in front as well. I shaded each part again. Here I didn't like how the skin shading looked at first, and after the critique stage this was something I adjusted. The first major adjustment I made would be to adjust the values and contrast. At first the colors were very pastel-y and too bright. My usual art is pretty bright and pastel-y. The Genshin cards have more contrast and saturation, so it makes sense that this was one thing I had to adjust. For getting used to different kinds of coloring, I find comparing the hue, saturation and values in the illustration and art style you're referencing to your own art and noting down the biggest differences and what you would need to change to get a result similarly to the references helpful. Like this you can learn about new ways to use colors. You could also apply this to other parts in art. This whole referencing and writing down differences is really important when studying art styles to me in general. But more on this at the end of the video along with my learnings. First let's finish up this illustration. Here would be a few things I changed in the end. For the leg in front, including both the shadow and light on the outline didn't look nice or make sense to me. I also looked back at Genshin's illustrations and they usually also have either just a shadow or light along the silhouette of the legs, so I removed the light here. For this leg, the lower part, the transition into the foot also didn't work to me anatomy wise. It looked off, so I gathered references with a pose similar to the card and adjusted this. Similarly to Yumari, I also changed up the shading for the upper body using other Genshin cards as reference. Anatomy wise, I also realized the arms were a bit long compared to the body. I made them shorter here. It was good that I had drawn the full hands before. Like this I could move them inwards a bit and didn't have to add other parts as well. Next would be the hair. Here I wanted to make it look more fluffy by adding in some more definition and strands. A specially referenced gun use card for this. Finally, I also wanted to add a few more white outlines to make the necklaces necklaces in front of Kira's body would look as confusing by separating them from the upper body. I also added a outline for the skirt to help with separating this from the pants underneath and around the whole body to separate this from the cape in the back. Next I added in the animal card placeholder, which I later changed up to a Sumeru one, which I found by Azurite on Ko-fi. I then added in some starry magic effects, mainly inspired by Mona's and Layla's wish illustrations, and along with the final adjustments, I changed up parts of Kira's necklace, making it blue not gold to make it match with the character sheet. Alright, that's it for Kira's illustration. Now all 3 illustrations are done. Let me know which one your favorite is. Now I finally talk a bit about my learnings along the way. For sketching, what I find really helpful is to add in flow lines and block in silhouettes or even values to help with making decisions for the pose and the outfit, as well as how the different parts of the character like the hair or capes flow. What's helpful at the stage and in the beginning as well would be to draw the whole body or pose, even if it's not fully visible on the card, at least for the sketch to make sure the anatomy works. Next, for line art, I used to draw almost everything I would sketch and then erase overlapping lines. To speed up my workflow, only drawing the line art for the parts that are visible at the end, already paying attention to the overlapping parts here, can make the line art stage go by faster since you have less things to line, and later on, before filling in the flat colors, I don't have to erase as many lines. For shading, here I learned how much adding the ambient occlusion shadow to simply show volume can help to make the character look nice. In the future, I can imagine doing this and adding simple overlap shadows as a base, and then adding the shadow and lighting with different directions and intensity separately. Since the ambient occlusion shading works as a nice base, I find you can add it in for any lighting scenario if you want to. And finally, for shading, I would also mention the importance of the principle less is more and focusing on clarity in the shading. I tend to overcomplicate the hair shading or just add too many too thin shadow strokes, especially while adjusting and painting over at the end. I often had to simplify my shading. Here I can recommend focusing on quality over quantity with the strokes you make. Be mindful what shadows you would like to include through the strokes and paint them using rather thick, few strokes to get a smoother shading result in the end. And that would be it for some learnings from doing the illustrations here and my art style analysis video before. I hope that it's helpful. Feel free to let me know any general feedback in the comments. You can also check out my Patreon, which I recently launched, where I, for example, have the full process video of drawing the basic body from my art style analysis video. Thanks for watching, have a nice day, and bye.